Rules Committee come to order, and thank you very much for joining us this evening. The Rules Committee today will consider conference report to accompany H.R. 6784, managed, excuse me. Excuse me just a second. We'll be holding here pending my opportunity to correct myself. Thank you very much. My problem is I went through sixth grade and knew how to read and read what was there, but in fact, this is not a conference report. This is a very important bill, H.R. 6784, Manage Our Wolves Act, and this represents a bipartisan viewpoint of primarily those that live in the West and that come into contact with our animals. And it's moving forward what I think is an agreement not only from the cattle raisers, but sheep and other people who have an opportunity to work. I want to thank Colin Peterson for his work on this. I want to thank certainly the work that we've had of a number of members, and I'm delighted that we are here today to do this. The distinguished gentleman from Arkansas is going to lead this effort, but before we go to him, I want to yield to the distinguished gentleman. Gentlemen, I've had a number of conversations over the last couple of years with who will become presumptively the chairman of the Rules Committee, and I want to yield to the gentleman for any remarks he'd like to say. The gentleman's recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. And first, let me just say, that I'm sorry that things worked out the way they did in your election. But I hope you know that despite our policy disagreements, you have always had our respect. And we have appreciated the courtesy that you have shown us. And I think that the many members that have testified before this committee, and I think more members testify before this committee than any other committee in the universe, but I think they would say the same thing, that you've always been courteous, you've always been decent to us, and we appreciate that very much. And I know under your leadership that this committee will finish the business of this Congress in a professional way, and that we'll have a smooth transition as we prepare for the next Congress. You know, we talk a lot about policy up here, and we just had a big debate about the direction of the country, and I think that's important. But I think it's also important that we recognize the people who we serve with, too. And we recognize that even if we have policy disagreements, we just have disagreements. If you and I disagree, you're not my enemy, you're just someone I disagree with, and vice versa. But I want you to know, for the record, and I think I speak for everybody on our side of the aisle, that we have enormous respect for you. If my wife were here, she would want to make sure that I also expressed our gratitude to Karen for all that she as a spouse has to put up with in this life, but for all her great work too, on behalf of a lot of issues that we have in common. So, as for the bill before us, I don't have anything good to say about it, so I don't want to spoil the moment. So I will just leave it at that. I just want you to know, Mr. Chairman, that we, on our side of the aisle, appreciate you and have respect for you. Yes, sir. Yield back.
Thank you very much. This is not the last Rules Committee meeting, so we're not going to. We don't have to go into a lot of things, but I want to say to each of you, including my dear friends, Judge Hastings, as I look at you and my colleagues, I want to thank you for this extreme opportunity that we've all had to work together for a number of years, including our staff members who have been not only professional but straight up also. But we'll save accolades for Don and others for another time. Thank you very much. Okay, we're delighted to have a distinguished gentleman from Arkansas who is here, and distinguished gentleman is recognized.
Chairman Sessions, Ranking Member McGovern, and members of the committee, on behalf of Chairman Rob Bishop and the Natural Resources Committee, I request a closed roll for the consideration of H.R. 6784, the Manage Our Wolves Act. This bipartisan bill would accomplish what multiple administrations have been attempting to do for over a decade by delisting a species the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has deemed recovered under the Endangered Species Act. It also empowers the states to take a larger role in managing the species population. The gray wolf has been protected in its original habitat in the western Great Lakes region under the Endangered Species Act since 1974. Beginning in 1994, the federal government began introducing the species to the western U.S. by relocating wolves from Canada and releasing them in the western states. The reintroduced wolf population in the West expanded more quickly than many had anticipated, and as a result, western states began to work with the Fish and Wildlife Service to better manage the species. This successful state-federal cooperation led to the Fish and Wildlife Service's first attempt to delist the species under the Endangered Species Act in 2009. Litigation activists struck back, challenging the agency's delisting decision and halting further agency action at that time. In 2014, the Fish and Wildlife Service, after noting an even greater increase in the species population, attempted to once again delist the gray wolf. Just as before, litigants immediately challenged the agency's decision. That same year, gray wolves in Wyoming and the western Great Lakes region were relisted by court order, citing inadequate state management plans. This 2014 order was appealed, and in March of last year, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals reversed the listing decision for the gray wolves in Wyoming only. This underscores the extent to which the Fish and Wildlife Service has been hamstrung in implementing the objectives of the Endangered Species Act. Rather than spend its limited resources protecting vulnerable species, litigation activists have forced the agency to continuously defend every action. In this case, despite scientific evidence conducted by the Fish and Wildlife Agency under multiple administrations from both sides of the aisle showing that gray wolf populations have recovered and thrived, the agency remains bogged down in costly, never-ending litigation. This bill would prevent the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service from wasting further resources responding to environmental lawfare by affirming its previous rules to delist the gray wolf and shielding these rules from further review. Finally, the bill seeks to empower the states to manage their individual gray wolf populations by directing the Secretary of the Interior to issue a rule to delist the gray wolf in each of the 48 contiguous states in the District of Columbia. To ensure that states are provided certainty when developing state management plans, this bill would also exempt this delisting decision from judicial review. During committee consideration of this bill, no amendments were offered, and in its dissenting views to the committee bill report, the minority offered no suggestions for improving the bill. Therefore, I ask that you grant our request for a closed rule for this common sense bill. And I'll now happily answer any questions.
Thank you very much. The gentleman is an expert in forestry. Is that correct?
Well, I've got a graduate degree in forestry, but I know a little bit about trees.
Okay. Well, and about forests too, And I have learned over my years, notwithstanding I do not have a degree in forestry, but I've spent a lot of time in the forest and in the wild, and animals and the free reign of animals is very, very important. The substance related to these wolves being healthy again, can you talk for me a minute about that subject? Because I spend a great deal of time watching, as I have time at night, the mountain lion that we know in the West is suffering, that competes against the wolves. And the balancing act that really is taking place here. Look, I'm not saying I'm a mountain lion person as opposed to a wolf person. I don't need to get that kind of mail. But I am aware that they compete against each other in the wild for game and the things that they do. And the wolves are winning that battle. What are the facts of the case from the forest today about this issue?
Well, forestry and wildlife management, as you know, go hand in hand, and wolves, like mountain lions and grizzly bears, are at the top of the food chain, and they play a very important role in keeping the numbers of other species at appropriate amounts. But really what's happened with the gray wolf, I think, is a success story that we can talk about with the Endangered Species Act, how the wolf was endangered, it was listed, there were great efforts to restore its populations, and even back as far as 2009, Fish and Wildlife was telling us that this species has been restored to acceptable populations and should be delisted. And here we are nearly 10 years later, and the gray wolf is still listed.
Okay, well, you've come prepared to discuss that. I have spent perhaps a little bit more time in understanding that actually some of these wolf packs are running out our mountain lions and making life very difficult for that balance to exist also. Notwithstanding, I just read, I watch things, I try and stay up with it. I guess I am a mountain lion person.
Yeah.
And okay, well, I appreciate it very much. Chairman Cole?
No questions, but I just very much support my friend's legislation here. And I certainly hope when it gets, assuming it gets through the committee to the House floor, that the point is made to people that, again, this is actually the thing that will destroy the Endangered Species Act if we don't, when all the conditions have been met, and that it's time to delist a species, allow that to occur. Sooner or later, if it never works out that you can ever delist, there'll be a rigorous rewriting. So this is really, I think, a way to help save the underlying legislation by just making it work the way it ought to be working. So I commend the gentleman for his effort. Yield back.
Sir, thank you very much.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Well, thank you, and as I said before, I don't support the bill, but appreciate the gentleman being here, and I will forego any questions.
Thank
Yield
you
back.
very much. Gentleman from Georgia?
No questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Judge Hastings?
Mr. Westerman, I just have a couple of questions, and maybe one will answer it. First off, thank you for being here. But when the gray wolf was considered to be endangered, and then delisted, there would have to have been, or is there with Fish and Wildlife, a goal or a number of gray wolves that would be acceptable to be taken off of the endangered list. Do you know what that number is?
I don't know the specific number, but I know that for Fish and Wildlife to want to delist the species, they have reached the target numbers for the population. And, we're talking about man interjecting here with management. The Endangered Species Act is a form of management. We consciously said we're going to manage this species, we're going to protect it, and help restore the population. And now that the population is back to an acceptable level, this is a new phase of management where we would delist it and manage the numbers at the constant level.
But then you understand, the only concern that I have they reached that acceptable level? And has Fish and Wildlife made that determination, or is the legislation that you're presenting today taking out of the hands of Fish and Wildlife, ultimately, what are their responsibilities to either take an endangered species off the list or keep them on?
Right, and that's a very legitimate concern. And back, as I testified in 2009, Fish and Wildlife wanted to take the species off of the listing.
All right.
So they met their objectives almost a decade ago, and the species is still listed as endangered.
And with good reason, because hunters and people who have a vital interest in that, and I readily understand their concerns. I lived in an area in my childhood where we were always worried about predators, or for lack of a better expression. We didn't have any wolves in Florida, but we had some pretty bad hogs and bears in the neighborhood that used to raid our chicken coops and everything. But I wish that we would let the agencies do their jobs rather than, because I do believe that the question that I just put to you, somebody from Fish and Wildlife could have given me an answer of their estimate of the goal that they wanted for the gray wolf to be delisted. But in the meantime, good luck.
And Mr. Hastings,
Yes, sir.
That's exactly what we're trying to do, is let Fish and Wildlife carry out the recommendations that they've made.
But there's also been a court decision that we are superseding, but that's of no moment. We go forward.
Thank you.
Judge, thank you. Ms. Torres?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I strongly oppose this bill. In California last year, the California Fish and Wildlife was so excited to finally announce that we had a family of gray wolves that was found. But that's 3 pups and 1 adult female and 1 adult male. I hardly think that that is an acceptable level that we would remove all protections for them. And with that, I yield back.
Yes, ma'am. Gentleman from Georgia. Gentleman does not seek time. Gentleman from Alabama.
I think it's a great bill. I intend to support it. I just wish we could include on it the eastern diamondback rattlesnake, which they're considering trying to list. We have lots of eastern diamondback rattlesnakes in Alabama, and the only time they're endangered is when one's around me and I have a gun. So I think that there are a lot of species that we could include on this, and I appreciate your work on it. Yield back.
Thank you very much. Gentleman yields back his time. Mr. Westman, I want to thank you for taking time not only to appear before us today, but for your, what I consider to be regular conversations that you have with members of Congress. I think that as an Eagle Scout, as an outdoorsman, as a person who tries to pay attention to world wildlife, we need to listen to those who can sustain our forests, who understand them and see the balance in nature. One of the things that a number of years ago that gentleman, Mr. Cole, and I engaged on was how really our Native Americans valued this balance of resources and assets that were available to them. And one of the things that has drawn us closer is that relationship that Tom so strongly recognizes. I've been through a number of years where we, did not respect the forest, did not respect the people who made their life in the forest, and to keep the assets sustainable. We're now seeing some terrible devastation in California, including the distinguished former chairman of this committee who had his house completely burned down. David Dreyer's house completely burned down, one of 1,000 houses on Saturday. It is right. And I talked to David, and he lost so many things, pictures and things that he had taken home. So Dave's house burned down. But my point is, this balance, we need you involved in that discussion. I've always counted on you to help us give that advice, and I appreciate it very much. So thank you for being here today, and we thank you for your service. Okay. Is there any other questions? We're going to go ahead and move to Chairman now being received a motion from the distinguished gentleman from Oklahoma.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant H.R. 6784 to manage our Rules Act, a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Natural Resources. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the bill shall be considered as read. The rule provides all points of order against provisions in the, the rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill. The rule provides 1 motion to recommit. Section 2 of the rule provides that on any legislative day during the period from November 19, 2018 through November 26, 2018, the journal of the proceedings of the previous day shall be considered as approved, and the chair may at any time declare the House adjourned to meet at a date and time to be announced. To be announced by the chair and declaring the adjournment. Section 3 of the rule provides the Speaker may appoint members to perform the duties of the chair for duration of the period addressed in Section 2. Finally, Section 4 of the rule provides the provisions of Section 7 of the War Powers Resolution shall not apply to the House Concurrent Resolution 138.
Thank you very much. You've now heard the motion from the distinguished gentleman. Is there amendment or discussion to that distinguished gentleman
Yes.
from Massachusetts?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee strike Section 4 of the rule, which will turn off the privileged status of Representative Kanu's War Powers Act resolution. This resolution states that that the Congress never authorized the U.S.'s support of Saudi-led forces in Yemen and would direct President Trump to end this support. Mr. Chairman, in April, the United Nations called the Yemen conflict the world's worst humanitarian crisis and found the Saudi-led coalition was responsible for more than 16,000 civilian deaths. The actions of the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen are fast approaching the level of crimes against humanity, and by supporting this Saudi coalition, the U.S. is complicit in this humanitarian atrocity. We must be clear, we must send a clear and unambiguous message to Saudi Arabia that their actions are unacceptable and will no longer be tolerated. It is shameful that we would provide a roadblock for this consideration of this resolution. It is long past time that Congress held a debate and a vote on this unauthorized support. Many members of the Rules Committee have supported this effort, and myself, Representative Hastings has, I think Representative Buck is also a co-sponsor of Representative Conner's resolution on the H-Con Res 138 on the War Powers resolution with regard to Yemen. And let me just say, it is disappointing to me that we are trying to hide from this debate, and also the larger debate on what our policy should be towards Saudi Arabia in the aftermath of the killing of Jamal Khashoggi by the Saudi government. I think if the United States stands for anything, we need to stand out loud and foursquare for human rights, and I think we ought to at least debate this. And if people want to vote no, they ought to be able to vote no, and I certainly want to vote yes on this resolution, and I think it's a mistake that we basically derail it. So I urge Democrats and obviously some my Republicans to support my amendment, and let's do the right thing.
Thank you very
Yield
much.
back.
Further discussion? Judge, you're welcome.
Mr. Chairman,
welcome to speak.
I'll be very brief. I echo the sentiments of the ranking member. It's a concern for all of humanity to do everything that we can, in my judgment, to avoid children starving. I don't necessarily agree with the assessment that the Yemeni crisis is more paramount than the circumstances that the Rohingya find themselves in Myanmar, Bangladesh, or wherever. And I don't know about how many of you, but I've been in refugee camps. And the first time I saw a person die of starvation, I really, 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 that's been a searing memory for me. I was with Don Payne, and we should, no matter the politics of it all and allies and not allies, we should be doing what we can to stop children there and elsewhere, including in our own country, from being hungry and starving. So toward that end, I think this is a worthy resolution, and I certainly support it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Further comment? No discussion? All right, the vote will now be on the McGovern amendment. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. Those have it.
As for roll call?
Gentlemen, ask for roll call vote. Clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole? No. Mr. Cole? No. Mr. Woodall? No. Mr. Woodall? No. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess? No. Mr. Collins? Mr. Byrne? No. Mr. Byrne? No. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Buck? Ms. Cheney? Mr. McGovern?
Yes.
Mr. McGovern? Aye. Mr. Hastings? Aye. Mr. Hastings? Aye. Mr. Polis? Mrs. Torres? Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman? No.
Thank you. If the gentleman would please advise me how the gentleman from Georgia is recorded.
The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, is not recorded.
Okay. Like to be recorded as no. Thank you very much.
Mr. Collins?
Say
No.
that he voted twice.
I would like to remind him that I should not circumspect. A lot of that happening in Georgia.
Clerk will report the total.
2 yeas, 6 nays.
Noes, the noes have it, so thank you. Further amendment or discussion? Seeing none, the vote now be on the motion from the distinguished gentleman from Oklahoma. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
Ayes have it, the ayes have it.
As for roll call?
Gentlemen, ask for roll call vote. Clerk will hold the committee.
Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall? Aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins? Aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne? Aye. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Buck? Ms. Cheney? Mr. McGovern?
No.
Mr. McGovern? No. Mr. Hastings? Mr. Hastings? No. Mr. Polis? Mrs. Torres? Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman?
Clerk will report
Aye.
the total.
6 yeas, 2 nays.
Motion is agreed to. Accordingly, the distinguished gentleman from the state of Washington, Mr. Newhouse, will be handling this for Republicans,
And I will handle it for the Democrats.
and the distinguished gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern, will be handling this for Democrats. Okay. There are no additional meetings that are scheduled this week. We're aware that there are transition plans that are going on by both parties and making those plans, so we will look to get back after Thanksgiving. Thank you very much. This completes our work for the week.